in 1947 when we became two different countries. मिलिट्री का ऑर्गेनाइजेशन स्ट्रक्चर ब्यूरोक्रेसी मोस्टली सेम है, आज भी सेम है, लेकिन क्या ऐसा शिफ्ट आया कि these two became poles apart?
It's so obvious in Pakistan that the army has entered into areas that it should not have and has directly impacted its democratic growth. But where we don't give credit to our armed forces is that they have restrained themselves. 1962 में हम बुरी तरह से हारे चाइना से. यही अगर पाकिस्तान आर्मी उस तरह से हारती because of poor civilian leadership, 100% वहाँ एक overthrow होता. Field Marshal Sam Manekshaw, with some of the earlier taller generals like General Thimaya, Field Marshal Karyappa, many others.
True.
There was a certain disquiet within the civilian government. Elections historically in Pakistan have been either rigged or have been insufficient, right? And I'll tell you, one of the ironies in Pakistan is that the most fair election that they say they had in their history was in 1970 when Yahya Khan, a general, was in power.
दोनों कंट्रीज में एक जो फंडामेंटल डिफरेंस है कि इंडिया कॉल्स इटसेल्फ अ सेक्युलर नेशन, पाकिस्तान कॉल्स इटसेल्फ अ इस्लामिक नेशन. डू यू थिंक दैट इज आल्सो वन रीजन कि इतना पॉलिटिकल अनरेस्ट इन जनरल हुआ है?
We must nurture our institutions, right? And however, whatever our political ideology may be, the country comes first.
True.
Our awareness about Pakistan deserves to be deeper. We have gotten carried away with the narrative. It's not to say that all's well with us and all is wrong with them.
True.
That's a very, patronizing way of looking at things. Pakistan has got things right too.
बहुत बढ़िया, and it's a brand new episode of Wassup, Aabir. I'm Aabir Lahiri. Joining me today in conversation is Aditya Sondhi. He's a senior advocate with the Supreme Court of India. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
You're coming up with a new book, Poles Apart, which is like about the military and democracy in India and Pakistan.
That's correct.
कहाँ से आया ये दिमाग कि इसके बारे में बात करते हैं? Because पब्लिक डोमेन में बहुत सारी कॉन्वर्सेशन होती है कि पाकिस्तान इज रूल्ड बाय द मिलिट्री, बट वहाँ इलेक्शंस होते हैं. इंडिया में ये होता है, मिलिट्री टेक्स अ वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट रोल. व्हाई डू यू थिंक ऑफ राइटिंग अबाउट दिस फर्स्टली?
I had done my master's in political science through correspondence while I was practicing law.
Okay.
And the next step was to do a PhD.
Okay.
तो मैं ये सोच रहा था कि किस टॉपिक पे कर सकूं और जिस चीज़ में मुझे इंटरेस्ट हो. And I was very clear कि this should be outside the law.
Okay.
Because for me, whatever research I did should take me into areas outside of the law, which is my everyday sort of bread and butter.
ठीक है.
And I've had an interest in military history for a long time.
Okay.
So somehow the penny dropped. I still remember, I think I was in Rishikesh, and I think the best ideas come to you by the river. And the penny just dropped that studying these two countries in the contrast of their military and politics would be an interesting and unique
Wow.
approach.
And actually these two countries are poles apart, literally poles apart, when you talk about military and democracy. कहीं पे democracy है, कहीं पे थोड़ा बहुत ऊपर नीचे है. अब it's for the audience to decide कहाँ पे क्या है. But what has been the research so far? When you started learning about, let's start with military. How are these two countries primarily different in terms of military? क्योंकि जब start हुआ in 1947 when we became two different countries, मिलिट्री का ऑर्गेनाइजेशन स्ट्रक्चर ब्यूरोक्रेसी मोस्टली सेम है, आज भी सेम है, लेकिन क्या ऐसा शिफ्ट आया कि these two became poles apart?
You're right. शुरुआत में तो एक तरह से आर्म्ड सर्विसेज एक ही थी. बट फ़र्क ये था कि सिविलियन इंस्टीट्यूशंस और सिविलियन ट्रेडिशंस और अवेयरनेस हमारे यहाँ बहुत ज़्यादा था. We had well-educated, Western-educated lawyers leading the political discourse. And they were already many steps ahead when it came to the preparation for a constitutional republic. So we had a constituent assembly, we had a constitution by 1950, and we hit the ground running.
Right.
So इसमें क्या था that we were already committed to an idea of civilian dominance in the public sphere.
And they were late in that.
They were very late. Okay. Their first constitution came in 56, which itself was already too late. It was almost 10 years after.
True.
And they were not blessed with the variety and diversity of the political leadership that we had. They had Jinnah and really nobody else.
True.
And once Jinnah passed, Pakistan is a very feudal country historically. The power structures were still feudal. They were perhaps not ready for democracy. And that led to a lot of civil unrest. You had the bureaucracy really in power, not an elected government. They had no real exposure to elections at all. And that opened the door. And ironically, and I always say this, it's an irony that the first recce into the civilian space by the army in Pakistan was at the invitation of the civilian leadership. It was not on their own.
Oh.
The army was brought in to quell certain sectarian riots that were taking place. And they acquitted themselves so well कि सबको ये लगा कि हमारी असली इंस्टीट्यूशन यही है. और उससे क्या हुआ, पावर भी आपने चख ली, स्टेटस भी चख लिया, और आपको ये भी लगा कि that we are the saviors of sorts. So that complex, it is a complex, because really the army has no business in civil space. But all of that put together brought the army directly into the forefront of governance. And once Ayub Khan took over, he ruled for almost 10 years. और मैंने जो 56 का कहा, that was also an experiment with the constitution. They re-experimented in 63. And the real constitution which governs Pakistan today is the 1973 constitution. So that's the third constitution, mind you. It's not an amendment. So by then, I'm afraid things were already too late.
And cut to 2024, we see like army is the superior, like the most superpower there. And how India is different. We also have a respect for army. Army is an important part of the entire political structure. Not exactly political structure, but it is it has a very intimate relation with the government.
Yeah.
How are we different from there? We have army for like army has its own command and everything, but does it also see a political interference, or does army has a political interference in the civilian rights and everything?
In fact, that's the part that I've tried to uncover in my book.
Okay.
That it's so obvious in Pakistan that the army has entered into areas that it should not have and has directly impacted its democratic growth. But where we don't give credit to our armed forces is that they have restrained themselves. And today we take for granted in 2024 that the armed forces are out of the political conversation almost, to the extent of them being alienated. True. And there is a lot of bad blood, if you will, within the veterans on many scores, like pay commissions, respect to veterans, post-retirement employability, etc.
Right.
But keeping that aside, I have shown in my book that there were instances where the Indian army could have been driven to take a political position. 1962 में हम बुरी तरह से हारे चाइना से. यही अगर पाकिस्तान आर्मी उस तरह से हारती बिकॉज ऑफ पुअर सिविलियन लीडरशिप, 100% वहाँ एक ओवरथ्रो होता. ऑपरेशन ब्लू स्टार की आप बात कर लीजिए, इमरजेंसी की बात कर लीजिए, IPKF की बात कर लीजिए. These have all been instances where the army has been brought in different roles and in very asymmetrical roles, many of which could have prompted a political response. But to the credit of the armed forces, for a variety of reasons, there was none. And one of those main reasons, it's not the only reason, but one of the main reasons is a certain inbuilt professionalism to stay out of politics. There are also other reasons. True. Because I think the army has come to realize that the Indian army was never part of the freedom struggle as such. It fought for the British regime, right? In World War II, we fought for, in a sense, an alien government. True. And it was the civilian leaders who were part of the freedom movement. So in terms of legitimacy also, I don't think the army really had that standing. But at one level, I think there is a certain restraint that has been shown, which should be talked about.
They certainly had the power. They never had the intention of actually overthrowing the government, right?
Absolutely not. There's nothing in my research which has ever suggested that the armed forces had even the slightest intent of a political coup.
Have you seen the movie Sam Bahadur?
No, not yet.
So it is basically a biopic on Sam Manekshaw.
That's right.
And there's a dialogue in the film where Indira Gandhi calls Sam Manekshaw, ki just report into my office. He goes, yes, Madam Prime Minister. He says, I have been hearing these statements. Will you overthrow my government? Will you do a coup? He goes near her, say, it's not that I can't do it. It's just that I won't do it. So,
and
that summarizes everything what you said.
I don't know how much of that is documented in his biographies. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But I will say this, that with Field Marshal Sam Manekshaw, with some of the earlier tall generals like General Thimaya, Field Marshal Karyappa, many others, there was a certain disquiet within the civilian government. for multiple reasons. One is the leadership didn't really trust the army, and that distrust was born partly of their absence in the freedom battle, the struggle. So they were not sure of their loyalties, number one. Number two, what was happening in adjacent neighboring Pakistan. You can't be blind to it. When your neighbor is having a coup after a coup, there is bound to be, and I think Jairam Ramesh says that in his book, that there was cocktail conversation. Okay, what's happening in Pakistan, yahan bhi ho sakta hai. So there was a certain phobia, and certainly with Field Marshal Manekshaw, it is recorded that Mrs. Gandhi was quite skeptical about a potential popularity wave, even if not a coup wave. But to his credit, I will say, he was also the one who pushed back on a decision to enter into Bangladesh in 71.
Right.
Right. And this is, I think, a classic litmus test of how far an army should push itself.
True.
And no further.
Yeah.
Now, an armed force is certainly subordinate to the government, but that doesn't mean it's required to take orders for the asking.
Right.
And if, as a leader, you genuinely believe, basis the inputs you get from your officers, from the intelligence, from the ground, that you're not battle ready. And we were not, because of multiple reasons. We had to, consolidate. There were climatic issues, multiple issues.
Right.
If you are not ready, you don't go into war to lose, right?
He delayed the war by a few months.
He delayed it basis inputs from others. And I think that shows the ideal sort of stature that a chief should have.
Very well said. Very well said. Let's go into the politics. Then we'll merge both. How exactly are the politics different? Again, the political structure is similar in both the countries. We follow the same MP, MLA wala scene. Correct me if I'm wrong anywhere.
See, it's actually very different, Aabir. I mean, elections in Pakistan, of course they have elections. And Imran Khan has won a popular mandate. And I think he's by far the most popular leader even out of power now. And though he came in with the support of the ISI and the army, he's clearly fallen out with them. Otherwise, he would not be in the position that he is today. But look, elections historically in Pakistan have been either rigged or have been insufficient, right? And I'll tell you, one of the ironies in Pakistan is that the most fair election that they say they had in their history was in 1970 when Yahya Khan, a general, was in power. So there is a big difference. Some of the most autocratic periods of rule in Pakistan have been those of civilian leaders, right? Bhutto, Nawaz Sharif, alleged to be rampantly corrupt, autocratic, etc., etc. So in a funny way, all of this has legitimized the army, and people have said, oh, actually Zia as a general was a better leader, he was an Islamic at heart, he had the larger interests of the people. तो वहाँ आप देखेंगे तो comparison बहुत stark है. हमारे यहाँ it's the other way around. In fact, the armed forces have really no say or no place, as it were, at the political high table. And in many ways, that has even worked to their detriment. There could have been instances where, the armed forces deserved a better hearing on many things. And you must have seen instances where veterans, disabled, specially abled veterans have come, burnt their gallantry medals because of the way they have been treated. So that is the contrast. And in Pakistan today, even though the army is strictly not in power, I have no doubt it calls the shots from behind.
Agreed. But that's a popular narrative. And I guess इतना popular narrative है कि वो सच के
सच है ही
वो सच ही है.
वो सच ही है वो.
But why do you think it actually happened? मतलब अगर कोई hypothetically सोच के देखे कि क्या हुआ होगा कि दो कंट्री एक ही चीज़ से बनी, सब कुछ सेम रहा. One, you addressed कि political leadership की कमी थी. Apart from Jinnah, you never saw anybody else. But what exactly happened? 75 years हो गए. कभी ना कभी तो stability आनी चाहिए. कभी ना कभी तो कोई सब कुछ छोड़ के अलग सोचेगा.
देखो, उसके बहुत deeper economic reasons भी होते हैं.
Okay.
Aisha Siddiqa, who's a scholar, has phrased a term called milbus, which is military in business. Right? So once the armed forces came into power in Pakistan, apart from the stature and the political power, they also gained tremendously in terms of finance, right? Directly in terms of banks, land banks, housing, the ability to be posted post-retirement is far greater in Pakistan than it is here. So that then becomes a package deal, right? और एक बारी वो हो जाए, आपके देखो कंट्रीज हमारी दोनों यंग हैं, 75 ऑड इज really not much in the larger trajectory of things, right? And a lot of countries have been vulnerable in the earlier years, especially in South Asia, right? Myanmar आप ले लो, Philippines, Thailand, they've all, हाँ, तो एक बारी आपकी कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल ट्रेडिशन है नहीं आपका, इलेक्शंस आप इलेक्शंस कौन कंडक्ट करता है आपके, दैट्स वेयर द इंस्टीट्यूशंस कम इन, एंड दैट्स वेयर आई हैव ट्राइड टू ब्रिंग इन माय लिमिटेड एक्सपीरियंस एज अ स्कॉलर ऑफ द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन टू से साथ साथ में आपके जो हैं ये इंस्टीट्यूशंस भी जो हैं वो बड़ी हैं. You didn't get the Supreme Court and the Election Commission and the media overnight in India. They evolved. They grew and they needed that space. And that space, I have argued that the armed forces have actually provided. उस हद तक हमें क्रेडिट देना चाहिए. हम मिलिट्री ट्रेडिशंस, गैलेंट्री, फाइटिंग एबिलिटीज, एक्सपर्टीज पे ध्यान देते हैं आर्म्ड सर्विसेज का. बट आई बिलीव देयर इज ऑल्सो क्रेडिट हिस्टोरिकली टू बी गिवन टू दिस फेज व्हेन यू नो द सर्विस इज केप्ट आउट.
अच्छा, आई आल्सो हैव वन क्वेश्चन. दोनों कंट्रीज में एक जो फंडामेंटल डिफरेंस है कि इंडिया कॉल्स इटसेल्फ अ सेक्युलर नेशन, पाकिस्तान कॉल्स इटसेल्फ अ इस्लामिक नेशन. डू यू थिंक दैट इज ऑल्सो वन रीजन कि इतना पॉलिटिकल अनरेस्ट इन जनरल हुआ है?
You know, that's not an easy question to answer. In 1973, when the constitution came, Pakistan actually branded itself the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. So, hitherto, if you read some of the earlier speeches of Jinnah, he spoke of Pakistan being a secular country. And he got pushback also from his own people because they were not convinced. But constitutionally, they moved to being an Islamic Republic. And General Zia was in fact the moving force. He was a very devout Muslim and he believed that Islam had a place in everyday politics, right? And therefore it had a place even within the army. And that had a very different effect. If you read some of the writing on Pakistan, that effect was on the army itself because then it became heavily religious. So suddenly officers found that their ability to be promoted depended on how devout they were seen to be, right? और उसकी अलग ramifications भी हुई हैं. पाकिस्तान has been accused of fostering Islamic terrorism. It has also been at the receiving end of Islamic terrorism. So in that sense, religion, yes, I think has come to bind itself to the polity in Pakistan.
तो हिंदूज पाकिस्तान आर्मी के पार्ट नहीं हो सकते वैसे?
हो सकते हैं. As far as I know, there is no embargo.
होते नहीं
होंगे भी ज़रूर. As far as I know, there may be some Sikh officers as well in the Pakistan army, but I am not familiar of senior ranks in the Pakistan armed services. I would have to look at that. For example, I don't know a Hindu, for example, to have become a general, right? We've had a Muslim air chief
many.
Well, I'm afraid not enough. We've never had a Muslim army chief, for instance. We've had an Air Chief Marshal Latif, and in the senior ranks, if you look at the breakup, you will not necessarily find too many folks from the minority community, going up. General Jamil Mahmood, his brother General Sultan Mahmood, they're both Bangalore people. Both of them were generals. There are instances. Nasiruddin Shah's brother, I'm forgetting his name. He's a lieutenant general retired from the army. But the point is, it's not a very long list.
गलतियां दोनों जगह हैं
एक तरह से.
True. जब similarities आप ड्रॉ करते हो तो बहुत सारी चीज़ें दिखती है ब्यूरोक्रेटिक लेवल पे, दिस दैट. बट अगर सोल्यूशन ओरिएंटेड एक कॉन्वर्सेशन करें, if we have to change or if we have to better both the countries in terms of military, in terms of politics, what is your suggestion? Like after doing this much of research, what is your suggestion कि क्या fundamentally change होने की ज़रूरत है?
You see, let me begin with the Indian example, and I have a chapter in my book which is really 2008 and onwards.
Okay.
Right? Which is not really the period where much has happened dramatically in terms of the military, but we had the CDS, जो Chief of Defence Staff की post थी, वो पीछे आई, General Rawat बने थे. And that posting, the CDS was in demand for many decades not just years. It came finally. It was supposed to make the interface between the civil military more efficient. But I'm afraid that hasn't necessarily happened. People felt that the army chief was too army centric. So the CDS, who should have spoken for the Air Force and the Navy, was more focused on the army. In a way, and this is all in the public domain, right? People felt he was speaking in a certain political voice, right? So I think as far as we are concerned, we should beware that the Indian armed services maintain the same neutrality and professionalism that they have done so hitherto, and the government and the people walk that extra mile to accord them the understanding that they deserve, right? I'm not giving a carte blanche. I know when it comes to AFSPA, and I have a chapter on AFSPA, that is in fact one of the darker chapters for the Indian Armed Forces. They have faced far greater allegations of persecution against our own people than anywhere else. So there is all of that to be answered on the report card. But I do think this is a period where the armed services have to remind themselves, especially at the senior most level, that they're still professional fighting forces. They have to stay adrift from the political sweep that there is. When it comes to Pakistan, I think in many ways, I think Pakistan is too far gone. I was surprised to see a return of civilian governance in Pakistan, because if you आप उनका अगर देखेंगे, एक तरह से वो म्यूजिकल चेज है. आपकी एक सिविलियन गवर्नमेंट होगी, आर्मी लौट के आएगी, जो भी हो जाए. वो नहीं हुआ in the last few years. And you have a new civilian prime minister. Imran is out of power. In a way, the stage was set for the army to return. It's almost expected.
But they didn't.
They didn't. And that tells you things. I mean, एक तरह से आर्मी भी रियलाइज कर रही है कि अपनी जो आपकी इंटरनेशनल स्टैंडिंग है, जो इकोनॉमिक मेस है पाकिस्तान में, एंड जो आपके यंगेस्ट सिटीजनरी है पाकिस्तान की, दे आर ऑल्सो फेड अप. इट्स नॉट, यू सी द आर्मी इन पाकिस्तान, आई शुड से दिस, has ultimately justified its position at the helm by creating an India phobia, saying that India is a constant threat and India wants to undo partition and reintegrate Pakistan into India. Now that sounded far-fetched some years ago. Today there is a political discourse in our own country which seems to share that view, right? I don't know how seriously it can be taken, but that becomes the justification then for the army to stay in power. Say, look, whatever it is, jitna bhi economic mess ho ya education, social services na ho, at the end of the day we keep you safe. अब वो बोगी जो है, the younger people with the dissemination of information have said enough is enough. We want a better life, we want technology, we want to study overseas, there are environmental issues.
There's a huge exodus of people from Pakistan.
Huge because of that. And so in that sense, your question is difficult. How will Pakistan ever reverse this? Not easy at all, because the ISI and the army are always lurking. And as I mentioned, coupled with the economic interests that they have, they're never really going to go away. So it's going to be an arm wrestle for them. The only thing one can hope, and in a way Bangladesh is an answer, because Bangladesh also was severed from Pakistan.
True.
As you know, it was East Pakistan, the 71 was severed. It has had its own run-in with military regimes and non-military regimes. But if you notice their trajectory of late, they're doing well.
They are doing well.
They're doing, in fact, better than people expected them to. And that's because there has been an NGO movement, there's been a civil society movement. For what it's worth, political parties have tried to...
and they are also an Islamic country, right?
Yes, they are. But they are trying to distance themselves to the extent possible from the military. And that has proved to be a success in the recent past.
Right.
So अगर पाकिस्तान में वैसे हो सके, वहाँ पे आपने देखा होगा उनकी जो lawyers movement थी बहुत strong थी एक time. Musharraf के time में the pushback from the legal community. The Supreme Court historically there has not stood as tall as it should have, but occasionally it has. Like more recently there have been some orders from their courts, including I think General Bajwa's extension, where the court came and nobody expected that. So if that institutional tide turns, civil society begins to shift, I think then it might be possible.
Now, a question from India. Since we are talking about institution, public domain में and politically बहुत सारे parties ने बोला है कि lately the institutions are also being paralyzed. be it judiciary, be it individual institution like EC, CBI, ED, and everything. If that is the case in Pakistan, what you mentioned कि वहाँ institutions की validity नहीं है, and if this statement is true by a lot of political parties, primarily the opposition, कि the institutions are getting paralyzed day by day, so aren't we also in the same path as Pakistan?
We could be, and that is where I think there is a lesson for us to learn. Ultimately, मैंने जो अपनी बुक में लिखा है वो कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनलिज्म के बारे में ही लिखा है. चाहे अप्रोच आपकी मिलिट्री के एंगल से हो, the theory I think applies across the board, which is to say that for you to grow as a democracy, a liberal democracy, you need to feed civil society, you need to feed institutions, objective, neutral institutions, and take the political discourse, therefore, to a far more responsible and a far more mature level. Or exactly the opposite has happened in Pakistan. Right? हम आर्मी पे फोकस कर रहे हैं, but साथ साथ में मैंने ये भी कहा है उनकी बाकी institutions have not stood so tall, and the media also has a very crucial role to play in that public discourse, right? True. Even if you look at the American elections, if not now, 2 elections ago, the influence that social media had, doctored social media had on brainwashing large part of the populace was massive. So if it could happen in the US, it could happen anywhere. And therefore, yes, I think there are lessons for us collectively to be learnt, that we all have to be on our toes. We must nurture our institutions, right? And however, whatever our political ideology may be, the country comes first.
True.
And that, in fact, that is one of the paradoxes for the army also. The loyalty of the army, and this is where you may find, you know, the chapters on emergency, etc. interesting. Yeah. Okay, who is your loyalty to? When you say your country comes first, who speaks for your country? Is it the government?
Or the army?
Is it the constitution? Is it the court? Now for us the answers are slightly easier, because government decisions are sacrosanct unless reversed by the courts. If reversed by the courts, you would expect the armed forces to obey that diktat, isn't it?
True.
But the bottom line is, nothing should be ever taken for granted. We should cherish it, that we have these checks and balances.
But किसका decision सबसे ऊपर है? मैं तो अभी भी confused हूँ.
हमारे कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल स्कीम में तो सुप्रीम कोर्ट का डिसीजन एक तरह से फाइनल है. Look, in India, things are final till they're final. Even a judgment can be undone by an ordinance or by a constitutional amendment. These things have happened historically. वैसा भी हुआ है.
बिल्कुल हुआ है.
But उसमें भी limitations हैं. ये नहीं है कि अगर किसी चीज़ को आप अनकॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल कहेंगे तो उसी प्रोविजन को आप फिर से रीइंट्रोड्यूस कर देंगे. दैट इज़ एनार्की, राइट? सो देर आर चेक्स एंड बैलेंसेस, बट ऑल टोल्ड, इवन एट द हाइएस्ट लेवल, if there is an amendment to the constitution, let us say, that amendment can be challenged in court, and if it is challenged in court and struck down, जैसे NJAC केस में हुआ था, Judicial Appointments Commission, it was a constitutional amendment ratified by the states, approved through parliament, but still not final because it was struck down by the Supreme Court. And if struck down, then that is the last word. And हमारे यहाँ, at least to that extent, and this is something the Supreme Court also realizes, that credibility has come because of the faith that people have shown. That has to be preserved.
True.
People respect it. Nahi to tomorrow people can turn around and say, how can 5 judges or 7 judges speak for us? If parliament has spoken and you have ratification of the states, there is a discourse to that effect also, that word is final. Majority wins. But हमारे यहाँ
majority wins
नहीं हो सकता है. This is the beauty of a constitutional democracy.
Is there a wonderful example of a country which has actually made a very good balance between military and democracy?
It would be difficult for me to say. I would actually argue the Indian example is a good one.
Okay.
There have been instances. There was a time when Turkey went through a difficult phase, when the armed forces were there, but then they pulled back. I haven't studied it in that much detail. I told you Bangladesh, I think, is a very interesting case study to see how, because they had many unique issues of their own. Even though they went independent, there was always this overhang of identity, ke are you still Pakistani? And look, language, as you know,
They fought for language,
is
actually.
very strong.
They fought for language.
So for a Bengali, whether it's an Pakistani Bengali or Indian Bengali, language does come first.
It is, I guess,
It's
one
culture.
of the rare freedom movement which is actually fought on the basis of language.
On linguistic, and that is the irony in Pakistan actually. हम उनको एक monolith की तरह देखते हैं, but the real divide in Pakistan is linguistic. Punjabis have dominated the politics in the history of Pakistan, right? The Sindhi speaking come much later. The Indians, that is the Urdu speaking migrants during Pakistan, actually reasonably well to do, well educated, land owning, are still seen as Mohajirs. They are seen as outsiders, right? Still. Okay? And that's because they really don't belong to the ultimate cultural, you have the Punjabis, you have the Balochis, they call the shots. So to return to Bangladesh, that battle was one of identity in a sense, and that was the insecurity in West Pakistan. Okay, look, these are not really our people. Ek to you're physically removed. It's totally unique.
Yeah.
Give me, it's very difficult to find examples where a country is
very rare.
Yeah.
But ऐसा नहीं होता है.
Or secondly, linguistically, culturally, food wise. And there was this complete disconnect. And when, Sheikh Mujib won in the elections in 70, which I mentioned earlier, people couldn't believe their eyes. And they said, you mean to say West Pakistan is now going to be ruled from the East? But if you respected democracy, that was the case. And they then grappled, with the Mukti Bahini, whether the Mukti Bahini should be brought into the army or not. उसमें बहुत issues होती हैं. ये आपको अग्निवीर issue में ले जाएगा कि आपकी जो social composition है army की, उस पे भी बहुत महत्व पड़ता है. Now Mukti Bahini were basically political fighters, right? So on the one hand you have those who fought literally a battle of independence, and then you had the armed forces which had the same baggage or traditions that the West Pakistan army shared with them, which was a very British style of officer and gentleman type of thing, which is to stay a step away from politics. That mix was actually explosive, and that led to coups and assassinations, and therefore, so to answer your question, I think Bangladesh is an interesting.
It's a fairly new country.
It's a very interesting
very new
example.
country.
Yeah.
They're doing absolutely great. I won't say like they are at par, they are flourishing. ऐसा नहीं है, but they are doing good for themselves. The digital transformation is like a fantastic example in Bangladesh. A lot of people have done research, have been writing papers on Bangladesh. The digital transformation, how they have digitized and how the YouTube channels have been mushrooming here and there.
They've done well economically. I think Henry Kissinger had said at one point very disparagingly that Pakistan is the basket case of the world. It was a very disparaging comment to make, but they've proved otherwise. They've done well economically.
True. What is the message to all those people who may be reading your book or want to explore more about India and Pakistan, and for who exactly you have written this book? This is for us scholars. This is for all those people who are actually very curious about India and Pakistan relations, or for somebody else.
At one level, I would say our awareness about Pakistan deserves to be deeper. We have gotten carried away with the narrative. It's not to say that all's well with us and all is wrong with them.
True.
That's a very patronizing way of looking at things. Pakistan has got things right too. But I think this study really is for those who value our freedoms, for people to understand that you really cannot take what you have for granted. We have struggled, we have made mistakes, especially in the early part of our history. I wouldn't say deliberately, in some cases deliberately, like emergency was a disaster that we could have avoided. But even otherwise, with China, the army advice, the military advice to the leadership was that China is a real threat. No one took them seriously. And that China, the 62 battle could have been much worse. The war could have been much worse for us had China not withdrawn. Right? We pulled it back. We did well in 65. We won comprehensively in 71. Things changed. But my point is you can't take it for granted. So really it is for anybody who is interested in understanding comparative institutionalism, constitutionalism, and in a very real sense studying our own people, till independence and partition, we were one, right?
Right.
And how is it that through that, some have said an accident of history, unintended, I don't know. It could have been, my family is a partition migrant family on both sides. They were well settled in Lahore and Quetta. They moved. They had no choice and had to start from scratch. Right? You know how many lives were lost.
But I doubt anybody have ever told you outsider. Because for when the moment you mentioned, what's the term you used?
Muhajir.
Muhajir. I know n number of people around me who their parents, grandparents may have migrated from Pakistan.
Of course.
And I've lived in South Delhi on Lajpat Nagar belt. So of course a lot of people from that particular belt.
Mr. Advani himself was a partition migrant.
I doubt anybody have ever been called an outsider, because that's slightly offensive. I feel that's very offensive.
In fact, that question doesn't arise. That doesn't arise.
At the end of the day, they are the citizen of that country. They are born in that country. How does it matter?
And maybe someone should do a study of partition migrants and how far they have gone and how well they have done in India. I think that would be a very fascinating study to pay credit to our system to say that we didn't think that way. But yes, the fact is that Indian migrants, the Indian Muslims who migrated, are still regarded as Muhajir and have to prove their loyalty in a different way. Don't necessarily move up the ranks, literally up the ranks as far as the armed services are concerned. You know, Musharraf was a Muhajir, ironically. He grew up in Delhi, as far as I know. But he was an exception. You will struggle to find those exceptions in Pakistan's polity.
Wow. On that note, बहुत shukriya for having this conversation.
Thank you very much.
It was lovely to have this conversation. बहुत सारे दिमाग के जो राज दिमाग में एकदम कभी-कभार सवाल उठ नहीं पाते हैं, वो सब मैंने पूछा. And it was lovely to have this conversation.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
And polls apart, I guess this is due for launch on 25th of July.
Around the 25th it's out.
And बढ़िया है, जिसको पढ़ना हो किताबें online and bookshelf में मिल जाएंगी. Do have a read, and thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.